Right, so welcome everyone to our weekly call. I hope you all had a fabulous weekend and are rested and raring to go for the new week. As you may recall from last week, the sort of main topic of our conversation today, Casey Deccio, sorry, I knew how to say it properly, and of course then my mind was playing tricks on me as I went to say it, which is a bit of a shame. But anyway, Casey has kindly agreed to join us. I saw him present just over a week ago at DNS Cookies Work in the early hours for those of us in Europe, but he gave an extremely interesting presentation titled, and I'll just read this so I get it correct, which is a peek into the DNS cookie jar, an analysis of DNS cookie use. And I might be wrong, but it's certainly the first presentation that I've noted that has talked about DNS cookie use, and I thought that was a very interesting subject and well worth repeating. So Casey has kindly agreed to sort of join us and talk about that, which we'll start in a moment. And I should also shamelessly mention last Thursday, some of you will be aware, we put out a press release announcing the first companies or organizations, more broadly than just companies, to endorse the European Resolver policy. So thank you to those of you that did that, many of you who are on this call today, and hopefully you'll be joined by other organizations in due course. And maybe that's something we'll pick up on in the discussion in a short while. But without further ado, let me hand over to Casey to just talk about DNS cookies. So Casey, over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Andrew. Let me get my screen up here. Make sure this works properly. All right. Are you seeing my full presentation?
Yeah, that's nice and clear.
Okay, good. All right. Let me get this out of the way. Okay, well, as Andrew mentioned, I spoke about some of this a couple weeks ago at DNS Org, and many of you were there because I saw you there, at least virtually. But that's okay. This is a little bit more informal setting, you know, a chance to share some of this again and see if you have any questions about it, have some discussion. But also, let's see, what was I going to mention? Well, I'll move on with that. But anyway, this gives a chance to sort of talk about DNS cookie overview. And as Andrew mentioned, this is also one of the first studies that, and actually the first study that I've seen at this scale anyway of DNS cookie use. So first of all, just to make sure we're sort of all on the same page with how DNS cookies work, this sets up the stage for the perspectives that we're going to be looking at. Within the DNS, we typically have two different perspectives. You have a client-server relationship between stub resolver and recursive resolver, and then a client-server relationship between recursive and authoritative server, of course. And that means when we're looking at cookies, we're going to be looking at the client-server relationship in both sides of these, both between stub and recursive and authoritative. And so you'll see when we go along with things, with our study, there's going to be a sort of a little map in the lower right-hand corner that shows you what aspect we're looking at, because we look at both aspects. Okay, and of course, the things we looked at with regard to cookies in this study, and what cookies aim to solve, is the idea of identity management. That from a cache poisoning perspective, the attacker is trying to impersonate the server from which the response is coming, so that the victim thinks that forged response is authentic and then can trust it. And so cookies help prevent that, but it also helps the server realize that a client is actually legitimate and not a attacker trying to reflect its requests with responses to an unsuspecting victim, a reflection attack, amplification attack. Okay, so that's the problem that cookies aim to solve there. And so in short, if you're not familiar with cookies, now it's different from the typical encrypted DNS discussions you've probably had on this list and some of the things you've looked at in these meetings, because the requests and responses are not encrypted. What happens here is that you have a client cookie and a server cookie. It's just a value that gets sent by a client to a server, and the server simply has to return that value. But in addition to returning that value, it returns its own server specific value that the client then has to return. And so this is not unlike other sort of identity management type solutions where you simply have to say, yeah, I see that thing and I'll return it to you. And if you don't see it, then you know there's some sort of a problem. Okay. And of course, this doesn't solve the problem of on-path attackers. This is strictly for off-path attackers because they can't see that value. Okay, so in terms of what we actually studied here with our experiment, we have several sources of data. And again, look in the lower right-hand corner and that'll show you what we're actually examining here. The first area of examination and first perspective is that of authoritative servers on the server side.
Hey.
Okay, was that for me?
No, carry on. I think you're
okay.
fine. Okay.
Fair enough. So on the authoritative server support, we looked at two different types of authoritative servers. One was top-level domains, or I should say the servers authoritative for top-level domains. And then also we looked at the Alexa top 1 million, the servers, the DNS servers authoritative for the Alexa top 1 million domains. Okay, and so we ended up with about 157,000 IP addresses associated with DNS servers for the Alexa top sites. And then we had about 6,600 IP addresses that were authoritative for the top level domains. So now we have several categories here. First of all, the DNS cookies, I didn't explain this previously, but it's an option carried in the extended DNS or eDNS record that's included in the DNS. And so you sort of have to, well, you don't sort of, you have to support eDNS before you can support cookies. And so the first category was sort of, do you support eDNS? And it turns out in the authoritative server support in general, there's high support for eDNS. And that's thanks to work by others along the way, including Mark Andrews, who's done a lot of work in that area at ISC and others. And so we, again, over 98% support eDNS. But when we start looking at cookies, there's less than 30% fully support. And what do we mean by fully support? Remember, there's the idea that the client sends a cookie and the server returns it, but then it also returns its own cookie. And so that's sort of mutually authenticating each other. And so there were some cases where the server would echo the client cookie, but it wouldn't return its own. That's shown in orange here in the plot. Just a small percentage of those. And those are probably cases where they're simply just echoing back whatever options they got back. They're not actually supporting it, but as a side effect, it still benefits the client to some extent, believe it or not. So you could say, well, the client benefits in that case, server doesn't have any benefit, even if it is sort of a misconfiguration rather than a feature. Okay, and then, but again, that sort of less than 30% fully support cookies. Now, we wanted to look not just the authoritative servers, but the recursive servers to see what they look like, because recursive servers can also be an amplifier and reflector in the case of not being able to authenticate clients, and it could also be that an attacker could try and spoof a recursive server to a client as well. Okay, so what we did initially was we gained a set of open resolvers just by querying every IPv4 address, and then we looked to see if they looked like an open resolver. And we discovered about 2 million. Those change from day to day, so it's a fairly fast-moving list. And when we then did our cookie experiment, we found about 70% of those open resolvers support eDNS, and about 17%, only about 17%, so about half of the fraction that we saw previously with authoritative servers fully support cookies with the recursive servers that we found. And of course, there was a small fraction again there that simply echoed client cookies back. Okay, so now we're looking at the client side. Remember that both the client and the server really have to support cookies for this to be effective. So now we're looking at the recursive servers, but we're looking at the client side. In other words, those servers sending out their requests to authoritative servers. And the way we did that was that we issued queries to those recursive resolvers for a domain that was under our control so that they would query our authoritatives so we could examine the queries that they made to us and look for cookies in those queries. Okay, so let's see. So we found about 93,000 IP addresses that were sending to us. And by the way, that's a lot fewer than the IP addresses that we were sending to, and that's because there was a lot of forwarding going on. Okay, and so that's why the number is significantly less. Let's see, we saw about 9.1% we're sending at least one query. So again, we've gone from, so this is client side again, and we're seeing about 10% of clients that are actually supporting cookies by issuing a query. We say at least one because there were some weird mixed behaviors, but at least one query with a cookie. Okay, so now we wanted to look at cookie enforcement. So the idea that, okay, so as an authoritative server, you see, actually, sorry, this is on the client side. When a client sends something out and the server doesn't respond with the client cookie, even though the client has seen that the server is capable of doing that, what's the response of the client? Okay, so what we did was we altered our responses. We had a specially built authoritative server that would basically send back after the client had sent to the server something, some sort of query. The authoritative server would respond with a cookie so that the client had some confidence that the server supported cookies. And then we would we send something back without a cookie or with a bad cookie. And here's what we found, that the clients, about 85% of them would behave normally when no cookie or eDNS was present. Okay. However, when we've sent back a bad cookie, again, from the authoritative server back to the client, only about 20% of the clients would behave normally. And by behave normally, we mean send us back the response as if nothing was wrong. So we sort of intentionally misled the client, but they still responded to us in 85% of cases where we just stripped it out completely, and about 20% of cases where we actually sent them an incorrect cookie. Now, the specification says if the client is expecting the response to contain a cookie and it is missing, the response must be discarded. And so that's sort of, now I know we're still growing with this, and but that's clear, when I say violation of the specification as currently written. And so it raises the question, what good are cookies doing right now, at least in the client case? Now let's look in the case of where the servers, both the recursive and authoritative. So what happens when we send back a cookie that's incorrect to the servers, or we send back a server cookie that's incorrect, or we don't send a server cookie at all, once we've already sent something to the server so they know they should be expecting a cookie from us. Now, the specification in this case says that there are three different options. First of all, they can just discard the query, which is sort of the most severe, or they can respond with a bad cookie error code, which basically says, yeah, try again, with this cookie that we're giving you now. Or they can respond normally. So it turns out, and of course, that's the most permissive, is just let it go. And over 99% of the servers that we contacted using this experiment, they just responded normally when the cookie was missing, or we sent an incorrect cookie back to the server once we'd already established that our client accepted cookies. Okay, so what that means then is that nearly all servers can still be utilized for reflection attacks because the servers are not authenticating the clients even with the cookies that are coming through. Now, the last thing I'll mention is sort of just some interesting things that we found. This had to do with this notion of what we call dynamic cookies, or I should say what are called dynamic cookies in the specification. The idea that a cookie is, the server will send back a cookie that that's different every time, and that's okay. It includes a timestamp as part of that. And so we wanted to look at these timestamps and see what sort of values we were getting. So we sent 60 queries to each server, and then we collected the cookies returned by each server. And then we sort of analyzed those dynamic cookies that we got to understand which ones were dynamic and sort of understand some of the rest of the behavior there. Okay, so what we found, we defined dynamic cookies by looking at an embedded timestamp in that server cookie that was sent back to us that was between 1 hour in the past and 30 minutes in the future. It was somewhat arbitrary. We said, well, that timestamp has to be somewhat close to now. Okay, and so we found that authoritative servers, for authoritative servers, about 99% were using this model of dynamic cookies. They returned at least one dynamic cookie. And for recursive servers, it was about 83%, so a little bit less. But here's how we categorize these. So if you look at these rows of numbers, these basically show the difference between the current timestamp, as in when we sent the query, and the embedded timestamp that came back. So we had 3 different categories. So this first one basically says these were all within about 5 seconds or so. That was our sort of arbitrary cutoff, which meant that we said these were probably accurate. Okay, meaning accurate timestamp on the server that was generating the query. So you see a bunch of 1s, maybe a 2 in there, but they're all sort of under the threshold of 5 seconds. Then we see this next category where, again, these 60 queries that we did, they were all consistent, but they were consistently out of sync. And we called this over 60 seconds. Now, we could have even looked at the ones less than that, over 10 or 15 or whatever, but we wanted to look at the ones that were way out of sync. And so here's an example where every time they sent us one that was 75 seconds out of sync. And so that was sort of interesting to see. And well, I'll show you the stats here in just a second. But the third category here is where it was a mix between accurate and out of sync. And we saw that like 1 out of 5 times, we'd see something that was out of sync. And this is actually indicative of a front-end server that we're actually hitting, and it's sending them to back-end servers, one of which has a timestamp that's out of sync, which is sort of interesting behavior. And so you can almost identify, we can't identify the size of the pool, but we can identify the proportion of the servers that are out of sync. In this case, it seems sort of like 5 back-end servers, 4 of them have an accurate clock, or at least by our standards, and then 1 of them that's out of sync, for example. So when you look at our results down at the bottom, we found that most of them, over 90% in all cases, had cookies with accurate timestamps. But we found a non-zero amount of those that were out of sync consistently. And by out of sync, again, this is over 60 seconds. That's how we defined it. 3%, 1.4%, and for the recursive resolvers, about 2.6%. Okay, and then this mixed accurate, we found, sort of non-zero, but relatively small percentage. But it was kind of interesting to see how that worked. The last thing we looked at is interoperability. This was a specific type of setup that basically says, hey, if you use this interoperability setting, you can actually work with different implementations, and so it should work between them. And you can identify those interoperable cookies by their flags. So they begin with, sorry, not by their flags, by their value. They begin with this sequence right here, hexadecimal 010000. And then they also have that idea of a dynamic cookie flavor, which is the embedded timestamp that's between 1 hour in the past and 30 minutes in the future. In other words, close to now. And we found that only about 4.2% of authoritative servers are using interoperable cookies, which isn't necessarily a problem. On the recursive server side, this was interesting. We found that at least 18% were using at least one interoperable cookie, return that to us from the server. But we found about 6.5%, which is, again, part of that 18%, almost half of that 18%. They were using a mixture of interoperable and non-interoperable cookies, which interestingly was the whole point of the interoperable cookies, was that you'd see it, the same sort of cookie value coming from that server every time. And so it shows some amount of backends that aren't actually using the interoperable cookie as it was designed. Then a couple things I'll just mention here as sort of reflection on this. clients, clients is actually the easiest place to begin enforcing cookies. And I know we've sort of had some wrinkles as we've gone along with like server pools, backend server pools and so forth from the authoritative. But it's easy in the sense that it's nearly stateless, in that when you get something back from the client, you can just, from the server, you can sort of enforce it. But anyway, that's sort of one of our takeaways. Servers, it's a little bit more difficult to determine client support. And that's in part because a client using cookies once may not always use them, either because it could be because of a NAT environment. It could be because there's churn in IP addresses and who has them. There's a lot of churn in resolver addresses, not necessarily for the big names, although it may be there too, but in general across the internet. And then one other idea for the servers, which is sort of a work in progress, is a way to advertise client support in the reverse DNS. And then servers could then check and enforce those advertisements, like saying, hey, if you're getting something from me, it has to have should have cookies, or it's someone else trying to impersonate me. And then, so just in conclusion, DNS cookies, recent standard that add identity management, and we found that about 30% of servers and about 10% of recursive clients seem to be using cookies. But only about 15% of clients are enforcing cookies properly, and less than 1% of servers are enforcing cookies. And then again, a possible solution is for clients to advertise their intended use of cookies. And I want to thank Comcast Innovation Fund for sponsoring this work that we're presenting today. And I see Glenn on here and maybe others from Comcast, but just wanted to thank them as sponsors for this work. I'm happy to take any questions on this.
You're very welcome, by the way.
Thanks.
Good work.
Fantastic, thanks, Casey. That's, I think, 2 weeks in succession where the Innovation Fund has contributed. So that's good to know. So could I ask you if you could, assuming you can access the Zoom tool, raise your virtual hand. If you can't, or in an environment where you won't be able to talk easily, feel free to type a question in the chat, which I can read out at the appropriate moment, and I'll take the questions in the order that they arise. I can see that Brett has indeed raised his hand, so do you want to come off mute, Brett, and fire away?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Casey. It's a really interesting presentation. Really useful thing to see the level of deployment of cookies. A couple of questions I have. First of all, worryingly, I mean, not surprisingly, you showed that there's different levels of deployment, and some DNS software is not being at all compliant with what it should be doing. So, and that's what I find a little bit worrying. So I wondered if you had done, or you were going to, or you were planning to do any research into identifying what that DNS software is. And secondly, I'd be really interested if you are planning to release any of the code that you've used so that I can test my own servers or those of my suppliers.
Yeah, okay. Let me take those questions in order. So you asked first about like where software is, right, with things. That's a great question. We haven't done a lot of that in the lab. We have done some of that. I don't know that we reported about it in our paper, actually, that came out of this, but the software is actually making pretty decent headway, even in a lot of its defaults. The question about enforcement that's a tricky one. And that's probably going to be, I don't know if you guys have talked about flag days in this particular group. Maybe that's a flag day that's upcoming, is, hey, starting at this point, when we get some of the kinks worked out, we need to have a flag day and start enforcing cookies at this point, right? I don't know. I mean, there's probably more measurement studies that need to be done that say how close are we to being ready, because you want there to be a little bit of pain, probably. And I don't want to speak for the entire community here. In my perspective, there needs to be a little bit of pain to make some change, some positive change, right? But you also need to be informed if this is going to break, 3/4 of the internet or something. that's maybe a little bit too much pain. So there needs to be some preparation for that. So I guess what I'm saying is, in summary on that item, that there is work being done to, to get cookies out there. Enforcement is probably the bigger thing that's coming, that needs to come. But there's probably more work that needs to be done in measurement and a flag day to hold people accountable. All right. Secondly, in regards to your question about is the code available? It is. I'll post it in a link here, maybe in the chat that you can get it from. It's not real polished. We put it out there so people could use it, but oftentimes our focus is to get the work out there, and polishing tools is admittedly sort of secondary, but it is there and you can sort of pick at it. One live tool that's out there that I wrote many years ago for DNSSEC, but it does some cookie evaluation, is DNS Viz. You can find it at dnsviz.net.
Yeah.
Like I said, cookies is integrated there, but it's sort of secondary and it's not going to give you a full evaluation. It will warn if you're getting some weird cookie behaviors, like if your cookie sends a server and then let's try that again. If a server sends a cookie and then it doesn't send a cookie afterwards, DNS Viz will complain about that. It will complain about some other things like that's the wrong cookie, I wasn't expecting that one, or some other things, but it's not a comprehensive testing tool. But I'll send you the code that we will build. I'll put it here in the chat in a minute.
Thank you.
Hopefully that answered your questions.
Yeah, thanks.
Good question. Thanks, Brett. I don't know if I know we got a few people that operate resolvers or indeed are responsible for clients on the call. I don't know if any of them want to just comment on their use of DNS cookies or not, as a case may be, or any thoughts they have on the results that Casey had noted. I'll give a chance to see if anyone's. John is indeed stepping forward, so thank you, John. Do you want to unmute and share your views?
So I guess, again, as always, more of a comment than a question, or maybe a question for future research, which is in Anycast environments where there are multiple resolvers hiding behind the same address, how does that influence cookie usage, and how does that break cookie usage, and how frequently is that breaking cookie usage is interesting. Because you're talking to different servers potentially on every section of a query, at least on UDP. So that's an interesting perspective. And I know we use, of course, multiple servers behind a single IP address, and there might be others that operate the resolvers in similar fashion, or at least front ends. So that might be an interesting path of research, and how frequently those are breaking.
Yeah, that's a great point, John. And so let me say a couple things about those. I mean, cookies are typically put together with, you have a secret that's on the server, and then you have some other information that goes on. You hash, like I don't have the spec in front of me, so I'm sort of roughly putting this together. But you have the secret, the client IP, the server IP, and then you hash those together to make up part of this cookie value that you're sending back to the client. And one thought is, to me, the most straightforward thing is, well, you make sure you're using the same algorithm and use the cookie, the same algorithm and same hash across those servers. Now, I don't know how easy that is. That's in theory what you might do. Then there's also the question of, well, what if your client changes, and you're hitting a different server? That's because that's part of what you alluded to, is you're hitting a different Anycast server, and what do you do in that case where the new server says, for example, actually, I'm sort of thinking this on the fly a little bit. That case may not be as bad as I'm thinking. You may be able to recover from that because you'll get the client cookie and you'll send it right in the response. I'm sort of thinking a little bit on the fly, but anyway, there is some considerations in terms of consistent servers, and from the server perspective. From the client perspective, it's a little bit more straightforward. But again, from server perspective, maybe shared secret across the different instances. Yeah, I don't know. This is maybe for the larger group, not just for me, but.
Thanks.
And those are some great research ideas, John. I'll add that we haven't fully looked into.
Maybe a follow-up bid to the Innovation Fund.
That's right. That's right. Sounds great.
Fantastic. Thanks, John. Anyone else got any questions for Casey or further observations? Give you a chance to think. I can't see anything in the chat other than Andreas casting aspersions at British beer, which I'm trying not to read because it's most distracting.
It's an old one from the beginning of the meeting.
Yes, yeah, I realised that. I didn't think it was in relation to the cookies. Otherwise, that would
No. For cookies, then I would have asked for which kind of tea.
I think he means biscuits.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, but come on. Those two are German. For me, cookies are kind of biscuits.
Yeah. Right. Any last questions for Casey? I'll give you, and thanks, Casey, by the way, for posting the links in the chat whilst we've been talking. Last call for questions. I can't see any more. Right. Well, let's draw a line under it there. So Casey, thank you. That's
Sure.
much appreciated. I think an underreported topic. So I think a few people will be taking away some food for thought on that. No pun intended. Right. Well, you're welcome to stay on or not as you see fit, but we will move on at that point. And changing the subject slightly, some of you may have attended RIPE today, RIPE 82, which started this morning. If you didn't, in my humble opinion, Jeff Huston gave a tremendous presentation, as he always does. This particular one focused on DNS evolution, which is definitely worth catching if you didn't see it live. And I will put a link to that in the sort of weekly headlines roundup this time next week. But just get sort of Jeff's musings on how DNS has evolved and some of the challenges that are now being posed to it, and whether there's any future to a single namespace, which I'm sure will be of interest to anyone from ICANN, amongst others. So quite thought-provoking, and in my opinion, also well worth watching. Worth the admission price for that alone, which, since it was free, is not difficult. But yeah, very interesting presentation. Right, in terms of other things this week, I don't think a huge amount has sort of caught my eye over the last week, other than, as I mentioned earlier, the update on the European Resolver policy, and thanks again to those of you that have now endorsed it. And I think there's got quite a lot of traction on social media over the weekend. So is there anything that anyone else wants to bring up whilst we're talking this week? Any other hot topics that have caught your eye, possibly linked to RIPE or indeed RSA, which sort of just about kicked off? I think at the start of the hour that kicks off. So, two interesting conferences this week. So anything from anyone else at the moment? Give you a moment to reflect. It doesn't look like it. I have to say, I'm a bit alarmed that Brett seems to have lost his Defender console, either that or he's relocated, which is...
He's still there. I've just moved the office around.
Oh, okay. I was going to say, shame if you're actually in a proper office now and you're not... you've lost access to the console. That'll be...
I went into the nominate offices on Friday for the first time in 14 months, but I won't be going back there regularly.
Can't say I blame you. Right, well, on that bombshell, let's sort of draw a line there. So thanks everyone for your time. Have a fantastic week, and we'll sort of catch up again this time next week. So have a great week all. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.